Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for stopping by. Today we're going to be taking a look at no line coloring. Now today's no line coloring is a little bit more complex and I know y'all are going to think I'm completely out of my mind, but I wanted to share this with you for a couple reasons. Number one, some of the principles for this are the same with more simple images, and then also I wanted to take a look at a couple new products today, well, new for me, but I really wanted to share these with you. For starters, I have an IndigoBlu Cling Stamp Set. This is called Poppycock. I got this from Butterfly Reflections Ink. I have never used this before, and I don't use cling stamps very often because to me, I find them a little cumbersome, but I enjoyed this. For starters, I loved the size of these images, and also if you take a look at the packaging here, you can see that they are the actual size. So you know exactly how big it's going to be for the front of your card panel. And I also really like these because they were nice clean images. The rubber cleaned really well and the cling on them was perfect. I've used cling stamps in the past where the cling isn't so clingy, and that's enough for me to quit using it quick, fast, in a hurry. But these were great. These were super great. Plus the details in these stamps, folks, it's just out of this world. So I have a piece of Simon's stamp masking paper cut out for my images, and I'm using that on top of the cling. I do not have the release paper taken off it, but I have it set on top of that cling so I can see exactly where it's going to stamp on my panel. And I'm just going to take that off there once I'm happy with where I have it. And then I'm going to close the door on my Misty stamping tool. You could absolutely use clear acrylic blocks for this. However, I knew that I was going to be double stamping these for video purposes, so I decided to use my Misty. The other thing I want to share with you today, this is the new Inkon3 Fadeout ink. Now, the whole principle behind this is that the ink itself is supposed to take on whatever color you use over the top of it. Now, you can use any light colored dye ink for no line coloring. However, sometimes that color will take on the property of that dye ink that you've used. This claims that it doesn't do that. Now, I actually found this to be true. I was really impressed with this. Again, I double stamped, and I think that will make a little bit of a difference, but I felt that I needed to because I wanted to make sure that it was going to really show up in the video. So I'm going to show you where I stamp this once, but just know that I actually do end up stamping it twice. You don't need to do that. I think that there's still plenty of detail. You can definitely see the outline of the image the first time. This was just something I felt I needed to do. So now that larger poppy has been double stamped, I'm going to place the second one on there, and I'm just double checking before I commit that everything is going to line up where I need it to. Cling stamps are kind of tricky. They're not at all, obviously, like clear stamps. So I just want to make sure I get this right the first time. This is a large card panel. It's 4 inches by 9 inches, and I really don't want to have to start it over. So now I'm actually going to place that mask on top of that larger poppy. I'm going to make sure that I have it lined up as good as possible. Now, because this is no line coloring, there is a little bit of forgiveness here because you can certainly fake it later on if everything isn't perfect, but I just wanted to make sure that I was good to go the first time. So I double stamped that second poppy. The first small poppy. Now I have the second, have it on there a second time. If I can talk today, that would be super duper. And I'm also going to be adding some leaves to this, and I don't show you all of that because I did try to cut down as much of this video as I possibly could. So this is immediately after everything was stamped. And I wanted to share this with you because dye inks traditionally dry back quite a bit. Even hybrid inks will dry back just a tiny bit. This fade out ink is a hybrid ink, and it will dry back just a little bit, but I was actually impressed with how dark it stayed over 24 hours. And here in just a moment, I am going to show you that, which is this right here. This was after 24 hours. There was a little bit of dry back, but overall, I'm impressed. I can still see quite a bit of detail. Now, again, this is double stamped. I think that single stamping it might make a little bit of a difference, but not by much. This was really great. So the other thing is, folks, these images they're really detailed. There are things that you could do to minimize the amount of work that you put into it. You certainly don't need to do everything I do on this, but this is my favorite way to color in, or to do no line coloring, and I really enjoy the challenge of a complex image like this. I am starting with R11, R14, R17, and R29. I want this to be a little on the orangish side. And this is a really great color combination for poppies in particular. I've actually used this in the past, and this is one of my favorites. So I'm going to start with this R11, and I'm going to start mapping out where my shadows go. Now, this is no different than any other coloring that you would do. It's always a good idea to map out your shadows with your lightest color. That way, if you make any mistakes, that you can always fix it later. It's no harm, no foul. It becomes that much trickier when you're doing a no line. And especially when you have a more complex image like this. So what I'm doing is I'm starting with whatever my eye catches first. So my eye is making sense of this petal right here. So I'm going to start with that. And then I'm going to move on to the next thing that makes sense to me. And that doesn't always mean that those images are right next to each other. You can absolutely skip around like I'm doing right here. So instead of trying to come up with this plan, just let your eye and your brain do the work for you, and that actually alleviates a ton of stress. The other thing I'm doing is I'm going to reinforce those folds or the ripples at the tips of those petals. You don't have to do that. It definitely adds more work. It's a lot more for your eye to take in. I think it's worth it, but if you're not comfortable with that, then absolutely skip it. And then the other thing is, see where I'm doing those flicking motions on the inside of those petals. Now, eventually those are going to be my darker shadow areas. And like I said, I'm just mapping this out. Now, you don't have to quite do it this way. What you could do is you could just add in those finer, thinner lines. Just map it out in the very basic form, but by just simply using the tip of your marker, outlining where that shadow is going to go in a finer line and call it good. You can always go back in and build it up and build it up. And I actually do that on this card, and I'll show you that. Now, I was kind of giving you a little bit of a peek where the ink is, that fade out ink is underneath this R11. This is a really light color. And you can just barely see that. Again, I think it might make a difference if it was single stamped, but I didn't mind this. I have used beige dye inks that seem much darker to me and have definitely changed the color of my markers in the past. So I'm gonna give this a win, folks. I think that this ink is totally worth picking up. So I'm still just going to finish mapping this out. I did show you, although I have this sped up, I did show you quite a bit of this flower because there is so much to it. I really wanted you to see this whole process. All in all, this card took probably about 2 hours. That was with the stamping and the coloring. I will go back in and I'll keep building this up until I get it where I want it. Copics are semi-transparent. So that's always something that you can use in your favor. You just keep building it up, and as you build up those layers, you can really see the impact of that on your finished card. And then also, because I don't have the safety net of a bold black outline for this, I am going to take my time. I'm going to keep my lines as thin and as short as I possibly can until I'm ready to finish this off. That is absolutely what is going to save all of your coloring. Because then you haven't overcommitted. You haven't put anything where you didn't want it, and you haven't ruined anything. The other thing that I'm going to tell you, and this is probably, I feel, the most important thing when doing a card like this, keep at it. Just keep going. There's definitely going to be moments where you're going to think that it's a disaster, that it's not going to turn out, but don't stop. See it through to the end. It's going to look bad until it doesn't. Now, I did take off both caps on my R14 here. This is my second to lightest color, but I don't know if you noticed when I was starting to map out one of those petals there, I could see the ink pool up at the tip of my marker. It did drip a little bit. It bled out a little bit on my card panel, so I immediately took off that other cap. That is a great way to equalize the barrel of your Copic marker. I don't use this very often, so it still has tons and tons of ink in it, and that'll happen. If you see that your marker is going to start bleeding out, and you can see it, you can see it start to pool up on the tip of your marker, immediately take that cap off. It'll make a huge difference. So at this point, I'm just reinforcing everything that I had done with that R11. I'm not extending any of my lines out too far because I'm not quite ready yet. I know at the end of the day, I can really finish it out on my last go around, put in deeper, darker, longer lines where I want them once I have all of my lines colored in. Right now, my focus is just to keep all of these petals separated and try to make sense of all of it. So that's what I'm focusing on. This is the R29. This is my darkest color. I went from R11 to R14 to the R29. I'm not going to use the R17 until I start going back to my lightest color because I don't need to. I'm just strictly working on the shadows and the definition of each of those petals. Now, at this point, I do start thinking that I feel that R29 isn't going to be dark enough. I tried an R39 on off to the side, off camera. I wasn't too happy with it. It was a little too red violet for what I was trying to accomplish with the orange undertones in this poppy. So I decided to do something a little bit different, and you'll see that here in just a moment. And that is, I'm going to bring in one of my gray Copics. Now, because I want a warmer color, a W in anything in the W, like a W3 would be perfect. However, I can't find my W3. W1 is too light and W5 was too dark. So I decided to go with a cool gray. So I'm going to use the C3. Now, again, this kind of goes back to the fact that Copics are semi-transparent. So I'm going to use that to my advantage. And I know that once I start layering on all of those other colors, all you're going to see out of this is depth. You're not going to see that I used a cool gray marker underneath it all. So I'm taking that C5 and I'm just going in and reinforcing where I want it the darkest. And that means primarily the center of that flower there, where the outer layers of the petals meet the inner layers of the petals, a tiny, tiny bit where the petals fold over themselves. I don't reinforce any of those folds at the tips of the petals. I don't need to do that. I just really want to concentrate on where it's the darkest. In some cases, I'm literally just adding the tiniest little spot with that C3, and I'm calling it good. You don't need to go crazy here. You just need enough that the eye catches that it's much darker in that area. Okay, so now I'm going to start working back towards my lightest color. And I already know that I haven't put nearly enough detail in this flower yet. But now I'm ready, since my flower has taken shape. And now that I can actually see everything that I have going on here, I can take it back to my lightest color and start defining those edges. And then I can go back in and start working on detail. Now at this point I'm doing some flicking motions from the center of those petals, or from the center of the flower out towards the edge of those petals. And I'm just keeping it pretty light. However, I'm kind of rushing through this. It's kind of hard to tell that because I have this sped up so much, but I am kind of rushing through this. So I'm not really paying attention, and I'm leaving myself some really harsh lines there. That petal that's right there at the tip of my finger on my left hand, I have some pretty harsh lines there. You don't want that. You want to keep those lines kind of varied, because that's what it would do in nature. It would it wouldn't look so blunt and so cut off, and you'll definitely be able to notice that when you get back to your lightest colors, so definitely keep that in mind. I apologize that sometimes this is off the screen. I was trying to get this close enough so you guys could really see what I'm doing here, but also I'm a page turner, and I do this because to me it's easier on my hand, because then I'm not trying to make it do something that doesn't feel natural to do. This way I can get my lines going in the direction I actually want them to go, and I'm not trying to force it. So unfortunately that means that it's off the screen occasionally, and again, I truly apologize for that. So at this point, I am back to my R14. Now, this is, again, my second to lightest color, so I still have tons of white space here. I have left myself a massive amount of highlight. You could absolutely leave it like that once you go back to the R11 if you would like. To me, it's a little too much contrast. The idea is when you're Copic coloring, or when you're coloring and you're trying to add depth and dimension, the idea is to find that balance between your light and your dark. So when you look at it, when you're finished coloring it in, when you look at it, your eye is actually taking in all of the mids. So if you have just enough highlight and if you have just enough shadow, all your eye sees at the end of the day are all of those midtones. So it's important to try to find that balance. At this point, I know that I have too much, and that's fine. I did that on purpose because I do not want to overcolor it just out the gate. I just wanted to simply make sure that I was getting, that I was coloring in the shape of this flower and I wasn't going to ruin it. So now that I'm working my way back out, I can start covering that up much more. The other thing is I actually end up switching from the R11, like right now I'm going in with the R11. This is what I initially started with, but I'm actually going to switch to an R20. My R11 is running low on ink. I could tell that when I was coloring this out because none of my darker colors were blending like they should, so I knew it was getting dry. I don't have a refill for it, so I'm just going to simply switch to another color. The R20 works pretty good. It's a little more cool pink than the R11. The R11 is just this side of being a nice peachy pink, but it still works just fine. If you have another alternative to that, then by all means use it. So that was the R14. I was stretching out those mids just a little bit more because remember, that's what's important to us, is those midtones. I felt like I needed to reinforce some of those nooks and crannies and those folds within the tips of those petals, so I'm doing that. The one thing that I really liked about this image is how big it was. I really had a lot of room to play on it. And again, you don't have to do that. You could absolutely, like the tips of those petals, you don't have to put those lines in there. You could build your shadow from the inner portion of those petals out and just call it good. It would still look fabulous. This is just something that I like to do. I think it looks fun when it's done. So I do this on quite a few of my flowers. And because I felt that these poppy images were so big, I really wanted to take the opportunity and play that up. Now this is where I switched to the R20, and you can really tell the difference in that blend. You can automatically see all of those other colors blend back and smooth out just a little bit. I will continue to go back in and work on this and add where I want to add to it, and then I'll smooth it out or blend it out again with that R20 just to keep everything looking consistent. But there was a huge difference with just the right amount of ink in my Copic marker. Okay, I really debated on sharing all of these flowers with you on how I colored them. It would have been outrageously long, and each one of those flowers I took the same approach. It's the same principle. I didn't deviate in any way that I could have showed you something new, so I really felt like it was better to skip that and add a few other things that I really think that are important to finishing off of this particular card. So I took out the other two flowers, and I'm going to share the rest with you. So I'm just going to finish doing this one exactly as I have been doing, and then I will finish the other two, and then we will start looking at everything else that we're going to do to finish off this card. The other thing that I'm going to note is now that I know exactly how I want this to turn out, I am focusing petal by petal. So instead of finishing it off as a whole, I'm just working it one at a time, and I do the same exact thing for those poppies on both sides. So now let's take a look at the center of this poppy. You could color this in so many different ways. I'm going to go with the traditional darker colors, not quite black. You could use dark enough gray Copics that you could totally make it look black. I don't want to do that. I'm pretty happy with kind of a grayish, a dark gray. I do end up adding some black to this later, but I kind of take a little bit of a different approach to it because I got to be honest, I got to this point and I was nervous. I was so afraid that I was going to ruin this, and it would have been so sad because this was a lot of work. So what I'm doing here is I have a C3 and I'm basically just stippling around the edges of the inside of that poppy. I did kind of draw in some of those lines that are as a part of the image on the inside of that flower. Later on, I kind of give it up and decide that that's not really important for me to keep that. Now I'm bringing in a C7. This is the darkest. You could absolutely go up to a C9. If you're comfortable with that, then by all means, go up to a C9, C7, C5, and maybe a C3, and that would make it look like you've got you've got black on the inside of that poppy. I'm just going to continue to stipple these colors on here. I wanted a little bit more textured look on the inside. I wasn't so much going for detail as I was texture, so I just continue doing this until I have everything colored in. That was the C3, and now I'm bringing in a C1. The C1 was pretty light. I probably could have skipped the C1 altogether and just stuck with the C7, C5, and C3. But again, I was trying to make sure I saved as much of the inside of this poppy as I possibly could. Now, that being said, I could have actually just stopped right here. Right here, that looked just fine. But I decided that I wanted to keep going and I wanted to fill this in a little bit more. So I did. Honestly, folks, when you know when to quit, you know when to quit. And apparently I don't. So again, I'm coming back in with the C5. I am kind of stretching that C5 out just a tiny bit on the inside of those petals. You don't need to do that, but I wanted to reinforce more of that shadow. I wanted it to be just a tiny bit darker. So then I keep working at this until I have it filled in. You could also do the inside of this poppy and, well, you could do it in any color you would like. Yellow would be gorgeous. Green would be gorgeous. You could do yellow greens. That would be awesome. You could do these in darker browns. That would also look super cool too. I personally prefer the black, but I'd love to see it in those other colors. All right, so now we're going to get started on the leaves, and I'm only going to show you one of these because I do the same thing on all of them. I did try something a little bit different on that first leaf. Decided I didn't like it, so I'm going to go back to the tried and true. I started with the G12 to map out my shadows. This is the G29. This is my darkest shadow color, and I'm just drawing a line up the center there, and then I start bringing it out a lot like a Christmas tree. I'm just doing flicking motions out from the center towards the edges, and then moving on to the next color. This is the G14. Now this one I do stretch out a little bit more, and I kind of, since these leaves are kind of jagged, I concentrate some of that G14 on the very edges of each of those, everything that sticks out along the edges there. And then I finish it off with a G14 and call it good. So at this point, we have our entire panel colored in. You could stop here. You could mount this onto a card base and you would be good to go. I like to finish my images off with a drop shadow. Now, normally that's not a problem. Drop shadows are really easy to do, and it's still easy to do for this one. However, you don't have your safety net of those bold black outlines. So you kind of have to fake it a little bit. Again, it kind of goes back to the take it easy, take it slow. Just use the tip of your marker to your advantage. Just draw those little fine lines. Make sure that you're not going in too heavy. Make sure you're not adding too much. You can always add more later. So my drop shadow is going to be as if my light source is in the top right, for no other reason than because I can. And I started with my C3, which is my second to darkest color, because I know I'm going to be blending this out. I can afford to go in with a dark color to start with. I blend out with the C1, then I blend out with the C00, and then to smooth out some of those harsher lines from that C00, I go over with my colorless blender and I call it good. That's it. It's as simple as that. You already have those lines there, folks. Just take it easy and you'll be all right. So this is where I decide that I want to do something a little bit different on the inside of this poppy. So I'm taking a black jelly roll pen and I'm stippling the inside of this with that. I started with the black around the edges of this. And then I decided I wanted to bring in some clear. I don't know why. I really didn't need to, but I did. So then once I start going with the clear jelly roll, I decide that I didn't really care that much for that. So I go back in with the black one and fill all of that in, almost all of that in. You can still see some of the difference. This is honestly something that you could probably skip. If you're not comfortable with this, totally skip it. It's a little bit of a risk. It could potentially ruin your card, but I think it looks fun once it's done. So now that I have that done, I'm bringing in a Nuvo glitter gloss pen. This is the clear, and I am going over all of the highlights on all of my images, staying away from those shadows. That sparkle really reinforces the highlights in this. Now I'm bringing in a Stardust shimmer pen, and I'm just doing a couple of those because I like how it finished it off. The last thing I'm going to do before I mount this onto my card base is bring in that black jelly roll pen again, and I just simply add dots around the outer edge of it, and that is it. I'm going to call this good. I really don't think that there's anything else that needs to be done to this. You could add some other embellishments. You could add some sentiments if you would like. I think it looks just fine without anything else on there. So I will have details and links over on my blog as well as in the description below. I strongly suggest that you check out IndigoBlu as well as that Inkon3 Fadeout ink. I am impressed with both, folks. I hope you enjoyed my card today. If you did, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Also be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already and tap that bell next to the subscribe button so you can receive all notifications. Thanks again so much for stopping by. Until next time.